time to extract the honey. All the honey supers have been moved inside and stacked up waiting to be extracted. Today we'll take a look at some of the steps that I use in extracting honey. Some pointers here may help you out when you extract honey from your supers. All the supers have been brought in the house, and they've been stored in a relatively warm place for the last few weeks and days as they've been brought in. They've been basically stored at about 70 to 74 degrees to keep them warm enough so extraction's not too much of a problem. I tried extraction once in October. Things cooled down a lot and it was a lot more effort. Let's take a look inside where I've got my supers staged, the extractor and the uncapping area. And I use several different techniques, some that are not perhaps standard, but they do work for me, and I think extraction is partly trial and error and finding what works best for you. Since I have a small kitchen, I stage things outside the entrance. Honey supers stacked up, and I always carry them with at least one sheet of newspaper so I don't drop any propolis in the house. And everything that I use is basically put on newspaper or cardboard to help keep things clean. This is mid-September, and because I have to stage things outside the kitchen, I've had to convince my wife that I don't get honey and propolis spread throughout the house. So this was a major thing to overcome during the years, but I've proven that I can keep the place clean, and it's through washing my hands and using the newspaper, cardboard, and other things. Since this is an all-day affair, I very often start early in the morning, 7:30, 8, and try and get done by mid-afternoon before it gets too hot. One thing that I find that's important, besides having all the right equipment out and staged for the work, is to make it just a little more palatable during the long hours of uncapping and extraction. A little music helps, so we get the tunes going. And the other thing that I find important is something to keep one refreshed. So a little libation, refreshment perhaps throughout the afternoon really helps. Alright, let's take a look at the setup in the kitchen. With several supers staged here, I've got also several others in the kitchen that I'm currently working on. So let's take a look. Although it's a small kitchen, I do have enough room for everything. I have the club extractor, which I rented. Works very nice compared to the extractor we had several years ago. And I do have this set up so that I can easily use a double sieve and my buckets, which I do have 4 or 5 available. Fill them as I need them. Some of the extraction I do, I actually sort all my supers so that I can do the early season supers first with a lighter color and lighter flavor honey, and then I also save the darker honey from purple loosestrife to later in the extraction process, and use that so it's in a keep it in its own buckets. Some people prefer that. This bucket's pretty full. We were extracting this earlier. Javier was here helping me from MCBA, and you can see the bucket is getting pretty full. This double sieve is the right thing to do. It has the coarse sieve and the fine sieve underneath it. This really works well. It doesn't get clogged up. I do scrape out this coarse sieve perhaps once during the process so I can have it flow a little bit better through it. But this double sieve is the only filtering I do, and it works out very well. Let's take a look at some of the other things. You'll notice I have cardboard on the floor to protect the floor and newspaper. Liberal uses of cardboard and newspaper. Everything's covered with newspaper pretty much where I'm working. So I got newspaper spread throughout the kitchen. several other supers I have, again separated by paper. I also mark all my supers when I bring them in by number. And this is number 11 out of 18 supers this year from 2 hives. 18 supers probably gives me in the order of close to 500 pounds of honey. Some of them shallow supers. But this was a banner year and I think a record breaker for our 2 hives here in Carlisle, Mass. Well, what about uncapping? Uncapping is the beginning of the process. I've got to uncap all of the frames, and I do that by moving them one at a time to this area. Now, some people use an uncapping tank. I use a big square piece of Lexan plastic. This is actually the cover to the capping tank that is rented by the club, by MCBA. I don't use a heated knife, I use a regular knife. Regular because A, it's not serrated, and B, this knife is really a bread knife. It's a long thin blade and I use it to cut the cappings off. Works pretty well. Of course, the capping scratcher is a very important piece of equipment, something that's highly necessary for this. Cappings I first drain in one bucket through an old strainer, and then I put the cappings in a second bucket, and later I'll have these cappings cleaned probably by the bees, or you can wash them if you prefer to do that directly. So let's take a look at how the process is done. Okay, we'll pull a frame out of the super, and we've got it here. This one is fairly nicely capped, and we'll take it, turn it this way, which is the top board away from me, and this allows me to use that as a guide for the knife. In doing so, it's a matter of first just slicing a little bit at the bottom, slicing away some of the cappings. And then starting and slicing upwards. Now I do this with a regular knife, not heated, and I think it's about as easy as the uncapping knife that's heated, but I haven't spent a lot of time using the heated uncapping knife. So you can try it either way, but you'll notice that it comes off pretty nicely and pretty quick work. The capping scratcher, of course, is what's necessary to finish the job on those places of the comb that's low or uneven, and this is one of the nicest tools to use that you can find for this kind of work. As a matter of fact, on some frames which may not be totally capped but is ripe enough to extract, I may just use the scratching tool. So that basically is how I do it. I'll take these cappings, let them drain for a while, and continue. This will go directly into the extractor. Let's take a look at that. It takes 3 frames of this medium size to go in the extractor, and balancing the extractor is an important thing, having the same frame size and filled frames. If it's not balanced, one is liable to have a lot of vibration in the extractor, which is okay because you can crank slowly and extract. You don't have to crank fast. It's more a matter of how long you crank so the honey can flow out. It won't flow out fast out of the honeycomb, and therefore cranking slowly works fairly well. This is an extractor we'll be using that has 3-to-1 cranking, so turning the crank is not required to turn it very fast. These frames are fairly well capped. I'll just make sure I open up all of the cells. And using enough water to keep my hands clean, I keep the knife handle and scratcher handle from getting sticky. So one can play with these different techniques of uncapping to find the best that work in your situation. I tilt this forward a little bit so this sheet of cappings actually hangs away from the comb and falls off. And you can see not a lot of honey comes with it. In some places there are, but other places the cappings really don't have any honey on them. So it's a pretty nice way to do it. Try to maximize the honey that I extract, so I do drain the cappings as I had mentioned, and try and get all of the cells open. A few cells left closed is no problem. They can actually stay until next year if you store your supers properly, and there's a lot of suggestions on how to store them. I do store them in the garage at cold, outside, obviously outside temperatures all winter long, and that works pretty well. So there we have another one we'll be extracting in a moment. Okay, the extractor is loaded with frames, and the uncapped frames are essentially just loaded in. The medium frames you can put 3 in because this is basically a 3-frame extractor. You can also use the large frames from a hive body if you were using that, or the shallow frames. And as a matter of fact, shallow frames fit in here. You can actually fit 2 together on each side. You can actually put 6 shallow frames in here at one time. So I will begin extraction, and you'll notice that sometimes there's some vibration, but one doesn't need to crank too fast. So let's try that. Make sure my strainer is under the extractor properly, and we'll give it a turn. Now I'll build up some speed as it starts to get extracted and the frames get lighter, but we're only extracting on one side at this point, so I'll reverse the frames to extract the honey from the other side. I always use the covers because I've noticed that there's a lot of airflow inside with the spinning cage, and at times, especially when the honey's thin on warm days, I've noticed that after extracting the whole day, that areas near the extractor, if I'd done it without the cover, would have this fine mist of honey on it. Not good if you're in the kitchen like this and you have your walls and tables nearby and everything else. It turns out that I'm a little more particular with my extraction than most people. This is something I do, but it's not necessary, of course. I'll extract on one side like this, and then I will move the frames, and I'll move them without turning them over, without reversing them. I do this so that any honey that might be trapped by the vertical bars or horizontal bars has a chance to flow out. So I'll move all 3 of these over, and in other words reposition them so that I can extract every last bit of honey. And we'll crank it again. And it's a little tricky to get these in here. They have to sit just properly. There's some narrow tracks for them to sit in, and then we'll extract one more time on that same side. and we'll reverse these to extract the opposite side. Before I do that though, I'll change the camera angle. But you can see the honey starting to flow now. As some of it coming out, and as it comes down the sides of the extractor, it will flow out. Just to give you an idea of what the inside of the extractor looks like, this metal cage inside will spin, and all of these frames will let the honey flow from this side that's on the outside and actually hit the inside of the extractor and flow down the side. What I was changing before, when I mentioned I changed the position of these before I reverse them, in other words I spin it twice on each side, I move it from one side to the other. So in moving it from this front position, I moved it to a back position, and that's so these metal railings don't trap any honey in cells. Well, now we want to reverse these, so it's easy enough to just pick it up and reverse it. I just turn it around, put it back in, and then I'll spin it twice on this side, first in this position, then I'll move it back and spin it here, as I mentioned before. Of course that's an extra work, and not everybody does that, but in my case I prefer to do it this way. The frame comes out nice and clean, and it can be further cleaned by the bees, or if there's no honey really dripping from it, I store them, as I had mentioned, in my garage. That's better. So this will be now used to spin, and you can see, I'll leave the cover off here so you get an idea of what happens, but even spinning it at a slow rate, a lot of honey is extracted. The one thing I can't share with you on this tape is the fact that it smells so good in here. It smells good when you're extracting honey because it smells like honey throughout the entire house. Quite a nice sensation. We'll put the cover back on to finish the extraction process. Okay, one more cranking and we'll be ready to take out these frames, put them back in the super for storage. This extractor has been outfitted with 2x4s on the bottom legs, and it makes it very easy to put your foot on it, help stabilize it a little bit. Alright, this batch has been completely spun out, and I'll take these out, which are infinitely lighter than they were when I put them in, and put them back in the supers so I can begin the process once again. All in all, it takes several hours to do this, and if I have let's see, 8 or 10 supers, I'm planning on spending the better part of the entire day starting early and cleaning up in the late afternoon. Cleaning up inside is the first priority, and then taking all this equipment outside and hosing it down is the second priority. And I do that usually before it gets dark and have it dry overnight. Return it to the keeper of the equipment at the club. Anyway, I hope you have a good experience with your extraction, and look forward to hearing about stories about things you've done to make it easier and make it go faster. Anyway, time to continue, and we'll just turn up the tunes and keep going.